Good evening and welcome. I'm Reverend Molly Vetter. I'm the senior pastor here at Westwood United Methodist Church, and I'm really glad and grateful to be with you this evening for this special lecture. The partnership between Claremont School of Theology, now located here on our church campus in our congregation, stems out of common values and vision, and it is a special joy not only to get to work together every day, but to host public events like this one that bring us together and help us deepen our connection. And tonight is about connection, holding together science, morality, and faith. We began tonight with some art as well, beauty and music. If you've looked at the program, you know that the gathering music we listened to just now was written by Dr. Lucy Jones. The basis of this beautiful music comes from a tone translated from climate data, from global temperatures from 1880 until 2017, gives the line of notes on which the rest of the composition was built. It is a work of art that bridges science and beauty. And tonight in this sacred space, I hope you feel at home as we continue the work of deepening connections in our community, in our understanding of the world, and with one another. I'm very glad that you're here. Whether you're joining online or are here in the room, welcome. And it's my joy now to pass the mic to Dr. Kwan from the Claremont School of Theology.
Thank you so much, Reverend Vetter. I'm Jeffrey Kwan. I have the honor to serve as co-president at Claremont School of Theology alongside my co-president, Bishop Grant Hagia. It is my distinct honor and personal joy to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Lucy Jones, a world-renowned seismologist, founder of the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, and research associate at the Caltech Seismological Laboratory. Dr. Jones brings a remarkable breadth of expertise. She holds a BA from Brown University and a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She spent 33 years as a geophysicist with the U.S. Geological Survey, where she helped pioneer methodologies for short-term earthquake advisories and led the development of integrated disaster scenarios, including the now widely recognized Great Shakeout Drill. She's also the author of The Big Ones, a compelling reflection on how natural disasters have shaped human history and resilience. What makes this introduction especially meaningful for me and for our community at Claremont School of Theology is a deeper and more personal connection. I first came to know Dr. Jones when she visited with her Aunt Dorothy Jones Hetzler, who came to share about her interest in including CST in her estate plans. Through that encounter, I later came to appreciate her family's extraordinary legacy of Methodist mission and theological education in China. Her grandfather, Dr. Francis Jones, served for decades in Putian, my own ancestral city, and was instrumental in theological education and in translating Christian classics into Chinese. I trace the lineage of my own Christian faith back to the Jones family. It was through Dr. Francis Jones that one of his students, the renowned evangelist Dr. John Song, that my own family came to faith. In a beautiful way, that shared history has now come full circle. We are deeply grateful for the recent gift from the estate of Dorothy Emma Jones Hetzler, whose life and ministry in Taiwan and Hong Kong reflect the same commitment to faith, learning, and service that we celebrate today. Friends, it is rare to encounter someone who so fully bridges science, public life, and a profound legacy of faith and global connection. So please join me in welcoming warmly Dr. Lucy Jones.
Thank you all. And thank you to Jeffrey and the school for inviting me to come and do this. It's an interesting topic that we agreed upon, science, morality, and faith in a time of disasters, which gives me a pretty wide scope for what I could be talking about tonight, and I could keep going for a lot longer than the time we have available. So I've had to choose what works for me, what works in this situation, and leave it to Molly to ask me more questions at the end for the parts that I didn't get to. I want to start with two parts of this, science and faith, because definitely our cultural impression is that they are incompatible. And there's a lot of mythology around that that I would say doesn't match really well. I'll just make the one statement that among the people, I mean, I've worked at Caltech for decades. Among the people I know there, I think the percentage that are active people of faith is about the same as the larger world, right? It really isn't the disconnect that a lot of people think. But a lot of people think that. I specifically remember right after the Northridge earthquake, one of my friends at my church had told me about this, that somebody had talked to her about me being on TV, and Elsa had said, "Oh yeah, I know her." And, "Oh, you know her? Wow, how did you get to know her?" And, "Yeah, she's at my church." And the guy literally said, "Oh, that can't be true. She's a famous scientist. She can't possibly be going to church." So I recognize that's a lot of what we're dealing with. And I want to start by looking at why I don't see them as incompatible, which is also a bit of a my personal narrative and faith progression. And I think the place to start is to first say what's science, right? I don't think it's often misunderstood from the outside as well. I would say that science is a process by which we try to determine what's true. And the fundamental of it is that we believe in truth. We believe in reality. It's become a somewhat more controversial state than it used to be, but it's remarkably fundamental, and it isn't actually that well shared even before everything that's happening right now. I mean, journalists always have another side of the story. In science, we have arguments, but when it's settled, it's settled. And it's either, you figure out something's true and then you move on and try and work on other things. That said, I will say we believe in that absolute reality, and our job as scientists is to try to do the best model of that. And good science is one that does a better job of approximating what's really true. The fact that we believe there is absolute objective reality doesn't mean my interpretation of it or my model or any of our science is a perfect representation of that. Every scientific advance is proving something else a little bit wrong, right? There's more and less wrong. There was a wonderful little article by Isaac Asimov about, worse wrong or better wrong, where, we used to think the world was flat. And then we thought that the world was spherical. Now we recognize the it's a spheroid. There's an elliptical form and unevenness to the shape of the Earth. So the purely spherical model was wrong, but it wasn't as wrong as the flat, right? And so we get to better truths, and we realize that we could continue to refine them. And sometimes you get something that comes along like, relativity, where, Isaac Newton wasn't actually right, but he's a damn good approximation for almost every situation. And so that's a pretty big shift, but it's not like we give up on Newtonian mechanics. It still solves a lot of the problems in the world. In this process, a fundamental of trying to be able to do this is you have to accept that data wins. If the data is compelling, you have to accept it and you have to change your mind. So as you heard, I went to MIT for my PhD in geophysics. I arrived there in 1976, which is just after plate tectonics had become accepted. Really, 1968 was sort of the big moment at which the data really came together about plate tectonics. And I'm going to tell you a little story here to get this idea. How many of you have heard of Alfred Wegener? We teach this now in school. Oh, we did, he got continental drift. Look at how foresightful he was. He was completely wrong. Well, not completely. He recognized a piece of data that the continents fit together. That data was there and was true. His model of why continental drift was that the continents were somehow drifting through the oceans and separating. And the physicists went, that's nuts. Continents are lighter, that's why they're higher. Seafloor is heavier, that's why it's lower. It's denser, you can't push a continent through the seafloor. So the physicists just said, we throw it all out. Well, the data was still true, his model to explain it was wrong. In the 50s and 60s, as we got a lot of data, well, from World War II and from the Cold War, we found out a lot more about the oceanic crust, and we were able to see that actually the oceanic crust was splitting apart and carrying the continents as passive passengers on this. So the same data, a different physical explanation that actually looks like it's probably true. And the data that pulled it together was a combination of earthquakes and magnetic stripes across the ocean floor. I'd spend too long if I tried to explain all of it. But a famous meeting in 1968 where the really definitive data came together and it was posted up at this big annual meeting. Everybody's looking at it. J. Tuzo Wilson, who put it together, was there. And this Harvard professor, who had been rather famous as opposing plate tectonics, comes into the room with all this data. And my thesis advisor told me the story. Everybody sort of quiets down to see what he'd do. And he walks around the room and looks at all the data, and everybody watches him. And he finally goes up to Tuzo Wilson and he went, congratulations, and walked out and left the meeting, went home, back to Harvard to lick his wounds. But he was, he basically staked his scientific career on saying this wasn't true, and it was true. But he was able to he didn't like it, he hated it and went home to cry, basically, but he accepted that it was true. Sort of accepted. They didn't hire somebody who actually did plate tectonic works for about another 30 years. But they stopped saying it wasn't worth it. And that idea, that was what my thesis advisor was telling me as I'm a graduate student. This is what you have to live for. You've got to have the data that wins. And so this fundamental principle, there are facts, there are measurements, and we have to rely on them, but we also have to be willing to change our models when we've proven it wrong. And that's an outlook on life. And for me personally, I'm also coming in to do this after having been brought up as an Episcopalian with my Methodist grandfather theologian, with whom actually I had had theological discussions. I got in an argument with him when I was 8 years old about how many sacraments there were. And my mother was horrified. I was arguing with, the famous professor, and my grandmother was like, shh, Patsy, let him go. Don't you see he's loving it, right? So and he showed me all of the reasons in the Bible why only communion and baptism had been sanctified by Jesus, and they just were in a different category than the rest of the sacraments that, are theologically fine, but they just don't count as a true sacrament. So I learned one thing is that you can argue about what's true in the church, but also that trying to understand God was worth a life effort by basically the smartest person I knew. So when I'm coming into science and there is a certain, well, why would you believe that attitude, I couldn't just say that's stupid, because I knew it wasn't. I had this whole family example of it. And, I said plenty of scientists are people of faith. There is still a culture that says everything's driven by facts and nothing about faith is a matter of fact, and it just shouldn't be involved. And the scientists who are atheists tend to be louder and more direct about this, and those of us who are people of faith tend to be a bit quieter about it. There's also the aspect that if you're going to have to test something's true, you need a null hypothesis, right? And the null hypothesis in geology and its cosmology, all of the things, is that things are what they were, right? That they were what they are now, that everything's been steady state. And you have to prove that there was something that changed. And so, but it sort of was around long enough without any way of disproving it that it almost became like it blurred that we hadn't really proved the null hypothesis that everything that is here now has always been there, right? So when people of faith talked about creation, that sort of violates this steady state hypothesis. And it was a hypothesis, but it had been around long enough to sort of merge around. Like when I was starting in physics, it was a more common belief that the steady state hypothesis had more adherents than the Big Bang hypothesis. But it was when I was getting there at MIT that they started to put together the data for the Big Bang hypothesis. I mean, we all listen to the Big Bang Theory, right? Now you realize it's sort of become part of our culture. But 50 years ago, it was pretty radical. What do you mean things began at a certain time? But as the data accumulated, and again, we can talk later if somebody wants to know the basic data that goes into the Big Bang hypothesis, but they were able to show that the best explanation of all sorts of features of the universe are best explained by a moment of creation, that we went from nothing to everything in something less than 10 to the minus 38 seconds. And as this was starting to really become clear, to me, we proved creation happened. That is by far the best hypothesis for our universe. And to me, if there's a creation, that implies a creator. A much simpler explanation for a moment of creation is that there was a creator, and probably best described as let there be light. And I found that once I came to this intellectual belief that God had to exist, I had to go back to worship, and I ended up back at church and have been ever since. So that's sort of the personal place that I got to. But you look at that whole process that I went through, and it's actually a lot like theology. Theology, people of faith believe in reality. We are trying to understand a different part of reality that's very hard to, there's no data, there's no direct data. You have to use inferred data. Like, I love C.S. Lewis's, point that we believe in goodness, and that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. And does it tend to imply that there's got to be a God there? And so we are using a different type of data, but we are still trying to figure out what's true. And that doubt is an awful lot like scientific being open to changing your mind when the data works. And there are plenty of unknowns in science that are mysteries. Right? So I never found it incompatible, what I did as a scientist and how I responded to what to me was pretty good evidence that God exists. And I know that this is a lot due to my grandfather, who was willing to argue with me on all sorts of different things. There's another step in this that's going to really play into my next topic of how do morality and disasters come together, which is if we accept that data wins, the data that evolution happened is overwhelming. It's at least as good as the Big Bang Theory. Right? My daughter-in-law was brought up in a church that basically told her believing in evolution was a sin. It was rejecting God. And she ended up marrying my son, who's a climate scientist. And, right? And accepting evolution for her it led to many years not being able to go to church. Right? And I look at that, somebody asked me yesterday about how do you deal with people who are science hesitant or something, and I realized I really don't. I can't start anywhere but that some of these theories have enough data and we've just got to accept that they're true. But accepting that evolution is true and believing in God means we have to say that God chose evolution as the way to create us. And the first response to something like that by a scientist is going to be, why? That's the model. Why would we expect him to be doing that? And, evolution is not nice. It's cruel. Cancer is an evolutionary oops. Autism is an evolutionary oops. And somehow that pain and suffering is worth it to God. And why? Personally, I found the answer through some insight with my priest talking about this about 20 years ago, looking at the work of John Polkinghorne. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of John Polkinghorne. He was originally a mathematical physicist, student of Paul Dirac's, was part of the development of quantum mechanics, who resigned from his endowed chair at the University of Cambridge as a mathematical physicist at the age of 40, saying, hey, mathematicians do their good work young. I think I've given what I have to give. And he gave it up to go to seminary. And he ended up becoming an Anglican priest and theologian. So he's spent a lot of time thinking about what is the implication of science for some of these theological questions. And his point was that evolution was necessary to have free will. And free will is necessary to have true love. If we say God is love, in a Trinity we're saying God's a relationship. So God created us to love him. If he had created us in 7 days as we are, we wouldn't have had a choice about loving him. We would have either been created as creatures that loved him or creatures that didn't. Evolution gave a completely free will approach towards how does a creature respond to the divine. And you could look and say, we went for 140 million years with dinosaurs that didn't seem to be really responding to the divine, right? Eventually, evolution came along and you had mammals and you start being able to get to consciousness and being able to start being aware of this. Who knows if he's done or not, right? What could be coming in further evolution. But that free will was so important to be able to love that he had to accept all of the suffering that comes out of the evolutionary process and the time, did go on for a couple billion years, to be able to have that agency. And if you ever want to get into it, Polkinghorne goes into a lot about how quantum mechanics and Schrodinger's cat is free will carrying out through the universe. But again, we have to limit the talk today. And one of the things that I then thought of as I'm looking at this is that means that we are, as human beings, a product of that evolution that didn't care about the divine, that we needed to have food, we had to procreate, we had to be safe. Right? Those are evolutionary drives to get us to this point. Right? And we're some combination of that evolutionarily derived consciousness with the response to the divine, with the call to the divine. And I sometimes think of this, it allows me to make a little more sense of St. Paul. He's part of the Bible that I sometimes find harder to. Anyway, the idea of the spirit and the flesh, the spirit being the part of us that is responding to the divine, and the flesh are those thought processes created to get us through that were the response to those evolutionary pressures. And so it's not that they're wrong. That the need to eat is not something wrong, but it isn't the divine. And I'm bringing this up, so this is sort of how this is like my mental model for how to think about God in the presence in the world that allows me to make sense of it. And it then plays into the rest of my life, which is time for my transition here to go from this topic to the ideas around disaster and morality. Right? So my degree and my original research was in statistical seismology, how to look at this, how one earthquake triggers another, what's the probability that it'll end up as a foreshock or whatever. And so it's very mathematical. But as we developed ways that we were actually able to say things, and we started saying things after earthquakes, it turns out people really responded to this. Instead of just saying, yeah, there's going to be aftershocks, we were able to say, well, we expect to have 35 magnitude 3s today. People felt better about it. And so I got put out in the public realm, and people are then listening to me, and people are responding emotionally. I was making people feel better. For those of us of a certain age, I've discovered the ones who remember the time I ended up on TV carrying my baby. It's a long time ago now, but he has his own kids now. But I was comforting a child while explaining probabilities, and I was making people feel better. And there were all these newspaper articles, calling me Seismo Mom, and yeah, right? And it kept up. And I think that part of it was that. I think part of it is you feel better when mommy tells you it's okay. So the guys would do just as many interviews as I did, but they'd only remember me. There was some guy who was my boss technically for a while, who was probably did more interviews than I did, and he was saying, I do all these interviews, and I still have people going, hey, do you know Lucy Jones, right? And I think it was because of being the mother, because that was the more comforting sort of thing, which seems really weird as a Caltech scientist, right? And then I met someone named Paul Slovic, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. And he created the field basically of risk perception. What's the psychology behind what people see as risky? Because it has often very little to do with an objective measure of risk. Right? And in fact, he came up with sort of this model of having parallel trains of thought. There's the analytical approach that is going to give you an objectively more accurate answer. Takes a lot of time to make the calculations. And then we have an experiential, a feeling of risk, which is what we make decisions off of. Right? And remember that evolutionarily derived feelings? Fear and risk are essentially emotions that we evolved to have to keep us safe. They are driven by evolutionary need. They are not the divine, but they are really deeply wired in our psyche. Right? And feeling safe and being safe are not the same thing. Right? So when I'm explaining a probability and explaining what's coming next, I make people feel safer because I've given them control over the situation. I give the earthquake a name, we give it a fault, we give it a number, and we say somebody understands it. And one of Paul's big findings is that we're more afraid of what we don't understand, And we're more afraid of what it appears the scientists don't understand. Right? So one of the things I discovered, we'd get up there and we'd do interviews, and people come and, so here are these reporters faced with a bunch of Caltech nerds trying to get them talking. And they learned that a good way to get a scientist to talk, to give you the talking head for the next TV broadcast, was to ask them, what did you learn? Right? That's always going to get a scientist interested. So they'd come in after the earthquake and ask, what did you learn in this earthquake? And we, being literal-minded people, would tend to answer that question and tell them the part of it that we hadn't understood before. Oh, this was new and interesting. This is why we think this is really cool. Oh, look at the way those buildings came down. We didn't understand we were going to have that type of failure. So what we were doing is, after every earthquake, was giving the message that we didn't understand why damage was happening. We're telling them all the things that surprised us. And we're making it seem more scary. And I finally realized that what I needed to do is go, oh, no, that was pretty much what we expected. We told, we've been saying for 50 years that that's a problem building. And explain it in terms of what we already understood rather than what we learned. And it wasn't because the reporters were trying to scare everybody. They were trying to get a scientist talking, and that can be a challenge, right? So this whole process showed me that the psychology of how we listen to it is way more important than often what some analytical scientific approach to it is going to be. 10 years ago, it's actually been 10 years now, that I completed my federal service and retired from the U.S. Geological Survey and set up my own nonprofit. Part of it was because it was 2016 and it was a really good time to not be part of the federal government. Part of it was because I had discovered at that stage in my life that I really wanted to be able to talk about policy. And scientists in the U.S. Geological Survey are explicitly prohibited from doing policy. Our job is to give information to the policymakers, not to make policy. And so to be able to talk publicly about what I wanted to talk about, I needed to not be in the government. And one of the things I needed to talk about was recognizing that what was coming with climate change was worse than what any of the earthquakes could do to us, at least on a global scale. Individually, when the Santa Monica Fault goes, we'll all suffer a lot. But on a global scale, we're potentially heading to a devastation of human culture, right? And again, I should be probably wrapping up pretty soon, so I won't tell you about, let me just say climate change is as pretty well defined as evolution or the Big Bang, right? We've added carbon dioxide absorbs heat, the temperature's gone up, heat is energy, we've added energy to the atmosphere. The first prediction of climate change that I first heard back in 1992 is an increase in meteorological disasters, an increase in the severity of tornadoes and hurricanes, increase in drought, increase in floods. That is a straight out prediction of having a warmer atmosphere, and we're now all seeing it, right? But when you actually look at what that means, we are on the way to having a significant percentage of the currently inhabited part of the earth become untenable, become unairable, too hot for human habitation or for crops, right? Especially in the Mideast. Now, one estimate I've seen is that we could have up to 1 billion people who will need to choose between moving and dying. We don't handle a few million refugees very well. What happens when it becomes 1 billion? Right? People talk about sea level rise, and if you were in a low-level lying area, it's a really big deal. One problem is most of us aren't in a low-lying level that's really going to be affected by that. And when we think that's the problem, we can make it not be our problem. We are increasing pandemics because humans are moving more into the wildland-urban interface and getting more interface with the biology. So we're talking famine, we're talking pandemics, we're talking refugees, and the potential for world war. It sort of sounds like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? The problem with saying that is that when it becomes too catastrophic, we can't think about it. That's one of the things I found with earthquakes. People would try to scare people into getting ready for the earthquake. But if you really convince people how awful it's going to be, you convince them to not think about it. And that, to me, in climate change is the really big issue, especially with the long time frame. And this is, again, I ended up having the chance to work with Paul Slovic, looking at how this all applies to climate and how we could use music to help try and change some of these emotions. I wrote that music you heard before, back when I thought data still mattered. When I thought the issue was data awareness, we have to convince you that the temperature's rising. Data awareness is not the problem. Climate acceptance is the problem. Yeah, it's getting really bad, but, well, what are we doing for breakfast, you know? It's so bad, we can't hold it in our brains. Because if there's a really bad problem, something that makes you really scared, and we don't like being scared, that's one of those evolutionary drivers, we then don't want to, and if we think there's nothing we can do about it, the only way to not be scared is to not think about it. And when it's taking 100 years, and we only really know it's true because the scientists told us, therefore the scientists understand it, therefore there must be a solution coming. We have huge emotional, evolutionary drivers trying to get us to ignore the problem. And that's where I can come back to that question of morality and faith in a time of disasters. With what is coming, it is absolutely immoral to ignore it. Not only are we going to be seeing huge suffering, the people who will suffer the most are the ones that have with the least resources to handle it. And let's be honest, the ones who've contributed least to creating the problem. And to just let it go on because we can't cope, I find to be an immoral decision. And I came to this personal decision that I needed to spend my time trying to help people cope with climate change and start to move to action. And I couldn't justify continuing to be promoting earthquake issues when we're ignoring this one. But our faith is also a place that can help us face this. For one thing, the solutions are communal, and churches are where we come in community, and therefore is a resource for us to work together and have the strength to face it, to be able to talk it over, find a way, and to believe that we're making a difference. Because there's two things, well, the most important thing in getting people to think about the climate is we need a feeling, what the psychologists call self-efficacy, a Christian would call hope. We need to believe our actions make a difference. And sometimes that feels really hard. And my response to that is a couple of different answers. One is the analytical one, which is an individual choice to never again buy a fossil fuel appliance. Don't get rid of the ones you have, but the next time you need to buy one, you buy that EV instead of a gasoline car. The next time you get a stove, you get an induction stove, not a gas one. The next time you have to get a heater, you get a heat pump and not a gas appliance. If we all did that, we would literally meet our emissions goals. It is a huge contribution. And if we individually choose to do it, and we tell other people that we're doing about it, and we talk about it at church with people, and we get our church to take that action, we are creating a community of people committed to getting this farther on. So that's the analytical idea. But then there's also, as a matter of faith, to give up on the world, which not working about the climate is doing, is to give up on God. It's to give up on our belief that we can make a difference and go forward. And it's not easy, and it's not obvious. But, we read that, if you see someone suffering and you do nothing, you left Jesus to be suffering. Well, there's a whole lot of people in this world who are going to suffer if we don't deal with climate change. It's not immediate. It's not right now in front of us. But our actions now make a difference. I'll also just say it's pretty easy in the current political climate, as the federal government is walking away, to think, what's the point? Number one, a lot of the actions that we need to take are local. We need to improve our local grid. You know, California produces so much solar energy, we're having to dump it during the days at this point, right? We are already doing it even without the federal government. The rest of the world is doing it. The American retreat from action on this is only leaving America behind as the rest of the world gets it done, right? So we are heading in the right direction. Our individual actions make a difference, and we can't give up hope in the bigger process because it really is the future of the world. So I hope that we can all believe that we need to help each other, we need to love each other, and love means dealing with the climate problems, trying to be the support to help us all overcome that evolutionary drive, the temptation of the flesh, to act as if it's not happening. Thank you. Are these not working either?
It's going to work. Can you hear me? All right. We're going to transition to a question and answer time. Whether you're here in the room or watching by live stream, you can submit your question by text. I never imagined myself doing this, but text your questions to 909-447-2514. The number is on the screen if you're on live stream or in your handout. If you sign it, I can attribute it to the person the question came from, and even if you already sent the question, you can go ahead and send your name if you want to be known in conjunction with your question to the same number. As you came in, you received not only a program but also a postcard with a photo of the cosmos, some part of this grand, do we call it a world? A creation. Which is a choice that Dr. Jones helped our planning team get to. We hoped it would be a sort of a touchstone for you, an icon of sorts to connect a cosmic view of our place with the challenges of this moment. So as we're continuing this conversation, I encourage you to hold on to that. If you want to put notes on it or write your hopes on it, it's available for your use, and we hope that it will be a remembrance of this evening. Thank you to the people who have sent in questions already. I'd like to start with acknowledgement for your contributions to our being safer in the world. My son particularly wants to thank you that the great shakeout was scheduled for an hour in the morning, which got him out of algebra. So thank you for your foresight.
Do you want to know why we chose the time?
Why did you choose 10:16 or?
Well, it's whatever the day, so it's on the third Thursday of October, and it's the time of day that's that day. So if it's October 17th, it's on at 10:17. And the reason we did that is because we had originally done it at 10 o'clock, and none of the radio stations were willing to carry it because they were doing national news at that time.
It's not at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
Perfect. Where are we with the earthquake early warning system?
Okay. Earthquake early, yeah, I didn't actually get to, I see we were asking what part I'd actually cover. Part of that evolutionary stuff that I got from Paul Slovic is how much we hate randomness, right? Random means you can't tell if you're going to be safe or not. You have no way to predict what's coming, and we hate that. So we have, over the centuries and in different cultures, come up with ways of explaining that it's not true, right? Think of St. Augustine, and right? Think of Psalm 18, the mountain shook because God was angry, right? Judeo-Christian tradition, we've made it God, right? The pagans made it you being hit by capricious, Vulcan had a hissy fit because Venus was cheating on him, so the volcano erupted. The Judeo-Christian tradition said, no, God is good. God's made a covenant with us. He would never just hit you like that. So if you got hit by a natural disaster, it must be your fault. right? It was a way of still having a good God in all of that randomness. And we still, right, we moved on from blaming it all on God. Not everybody's given that up, but most people have. But we still want to get rid of it. So we want prediction really badly. And in fact, my thesis and the whole getting into statistical seismology was my attempt to predict earthquakes. That's what I thought I was going to be doing in my career. What we did was determine that earthquakes are fundamentally unpredictable. They really, on human timescales, they really are random. Okay? And the prediction as people want it is just probably not there. If you look at it logically, it's not going to do you much good. Do you want 2 hours to get out of a building or a building that doesn't fall down in the first place? Pretty obvious answer. But emotionally, we want to know what's coming. So earthquake early warning is our best attempt. We can't tell you when the earthquake's going to start, but we can tell you really quickly that the earthquake has started and potentially get that information to you before the waves get to you. So we now have, close to 1,000 seismic stations around Southern California. We are developing technologies to use fiber cables as basically this really dense distribution, get even better. The technology is there. We're getting the messages out within a couple of seconds. And so your success at getting it is going to depend on how far away you are. The bad news is the farther away you are, the less shaking it is and the more warning you get. Right? So if you lived in Northridge in 1994, you wouldn't have gotten a warning. Pasadena would have gotten a warning, but we didn't really get much damage. But for the really big earthquakes like the San Andreas, where the fault is so long, the earthquake started in epicenter and rupture up the fault. That earthquake's going to take 100 seconds to happen. So we can be getting the message to you that an earthquake's underway, and then there will be updates. It's propagating towards you. You're going to get even stronger shaking. So just be aware that those messages are going to be not a simple yes or no. They're going to grow with time. But the system's out there and working, and it's being maintained, and we're continuing to try and find ways to improve it.
That's great. Thank you so much. The next question I have comes from Hawk Hawkins, who's here and is doing disaster response coordination for the United Methodist Church following last year's wildfires. Hawk asks, if you could implement one policy change tomorrow that would save the most lives in future disasters, what would it be?
Building codes.
Building codes.
On the fire codes, we have something called Section 7A. If you build your building to that code, you're going to be you're much less likely to burn down. It's only required in what's called the wildland-urban interface. Most of the area in Altadena that burned down is not being required to rebuild to that standard. You could choose to. It adds about $1,000. It's not expensive. The improvements are really minimal, especially if you're building from scratch. Retrofitting costs somewhat more. And I will tell you, I live in Pasadena, about a mile south of the 210 freeway, which was the edge of the evacuation zone. But I know that there could be fires coming from elsewhere, and after the earthquake, there are going to be fires coming from a lot of places. And I am implementing as much of Section 7A as I can at my home. So a big part of it is 5 feet of non-combustible material as an apron around your house. We have pulled out a bunch of plants. Our gardener's going, why are you getting rid of that camellia? Because that's right. Anyway, we've put that in. We're doing it gradually. We've covered our eaves. We are exploring how to get rid of some wooden paneling. We took out a wooden gate. And I have had firemen tell me, that's not perfect, but if I see a house with that non-combustible space and another house that's got the bushes right up against it, I'm going to take the stand on your house because I'm more likely to succeed. And that's not them doing a bad thing. It's trying to maximize the effectiveness of very limited resources. So, and on seismic issues, same thing. Get a structural foundation specialist and ask them what you could do to improve the safety of your house. I've done it the 4 times we've bought a house. Once we didn't have to do anything. The most we've ever spent is $1,500. Of course, we didn't buy the really bad houses, but you can always, you can probably make your house safer, and it's worth trying to do it, and it's not that much money.
Thank you. I have a question that comes from Navina Satta from LA Climate Week, who is grateful for your words and your work and names the challenge of giving hope and communicating positivity through science to orient us toward the future. We think artists and philosophers and filmmakers can help giving hope. What are the other missing factors? What helps turn or bridge the science, facts, and hopefulness?
I have been trying to do this through a project that we've called Tempo, which is bringing together the climate scientists who know what we need to do and are actually really pretty optimistic. I like one scientist says, like, we know most of what we need to do. It's not easy, it's really hard, but we do know what'll help. And we've brought them together with the psychologists like Paul Slovic that I was talking about, who understands these emotional barriers, with musicians to look at how we use music to change the emotional climate about climate change. And I think what's most effective is recognizing that this is not an issue about data. It is an issue about these emotional barriers to committing to doing this and being able to address that, sometimes just explicitly. One of the other things I realized in working with Paul, he would talk about these barriers and how important the emotions are. And you go to a bunch of scientists and tell them, you've got to do storytelling, you've got to give this emotional message. And they're like, what do you mean? It's data that matters. And which, yes, but, right? What I recognize is that scientists, because we live with data, we develop an emotional reaction to the data. I look at the Keeling curve of CO2 distributions or concentrations, and it scares me. I have an emotional reaction to that information. And most scientists do, because that's our lives. And we then think that if we just need, if somebody else doesn't have the emotion there, they aren't the commitment, we just need to give them more data, right? And that's been a really big mistake. So it's not that the data's wrong, it's that that commitment to action requires the emotional engagement of that evolutionary drive to safety. And we have to get our emotions engaged, and as scientists, we've usually done it in a different way. So I think it is recognizing that emotional need, but not giving up on the data, which is, right, that could be a challenge, finding that path within there. But if you can't do one or the other, I don't think. You have to figure out how you merge them.
So it's almost Holy Week, and in Matthew's gospel, there's an earthquake at the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. Does that give you joy or make you cringe or something else?
That is a really, it depends on the year. Sometimes I hear that and go, I can imagine that it happened, and it was, watching people interpret the occurrence of what I know to be a random occurrence and give other meaning to it. I've watched it happen too often to be surprised. I could also, I can accept that maybe God did cause an earthquake to happen at that point. And I don't need to believe one way or the other to feel like a good Christian.
I know we're nearing the end of our time, and we're not going to get to all of the good questions that have come in, but a lot of them, several questions, are inviting your help in navigating the temptation to say, oh, well, we're people of faith, God will just work this out for us, or it's not that big of a deal, or look how we solved acid rain, this is overblown. What would you say sort of in response to that?
Yeah, okay, so overblown, there's the real challenge, because this is not overblown. We don't have severe action soon. We're already burning down our city, for God's sakes. Excuse me. It is.
I think it's aptly used in this setting.
It's already happening. It's going to get worse. And to turn it around is going to require a lot of time. Basically, we've been putting blankets on top. If we cut out all carbon emissions today, we'd still go up by at least another 0.5 degree C. which is about another 20–30% in the increased temperature, if we stop today, which we're a long ways from doing, right? So it's not overblown, it's huge, it's a crisis. It is inviting the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The problem is you get too far down that road and people turn it off because they're too scared and they can't think about it. So there's a challenge. You've got to figure out how to do it that way. God's going to take care of it is cowardice. It's not acknowledging your own responsibility to respond to the call to love the divine. God doesn't have any hands in this world but us. And he's not going to protect us. He's not going to somehow magically come in and change the consequences of our actions. He let the dinosaurs go extinct. I mean, it's a much bigger process than that. And that one I find extremely frustrating because there's denying human agency is denying that free will and that love. And free will, it's obviously incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think we don't so easily apply that way of thinking to disaster responses. Like, we don't say, we're sorry your home burned down. I'm sure God will rebuild it for you, right? Like we have no problem responding to disasters after the fact, but can we also figure out better ways of applying that to preparedness and resilience that will,
and that's
or mitigation
actually,
of...
Right. I mean, mitigation, every dollar spent on mitigation saves you $6 afterwards, right? It's way more effective, right? But that, go back to our emotional response. The suddenness of the disaster gives us a different emotional response, and we have much more pity for the victims, right? One of the other things that goes on in here, the same thing, of the need to feel safe. One way to feel safe is to, when you see someone else with problems, is to blame them. If somebody's poor because they were lazy, I don't have to worry that I'm going to become poor because a car hits me and I get an accident, I can no longer go to work. Right? You don't have to think in those terms. And seeing suffering, and especially poverty, as a moral failing is a way of protecting yourself. Or even think, you just hear somebody has cancer. What's the first thing you think of? Well, did he smoke? You want to blame him for that rather than thinking the cancer could strike you. So all of those are thought processes that go on. And the whole prevention part, afterwards, disasters somehow seem like ones that are farther apart from being at fault. That's why we went and blamed God, and we had all of those theological discussions for centuries. But it's a different emotional response, and we're engaging a whole different system than we're looking at before. I'll go back and say, I think doing resilience through churches is a way of getting around this. This is caring for your neighbor to help, and I've also found that starting with getting ready for response is more likely to get people started. So we usually start with a communications drill. Make sure you can figure out who needs help after the event. And we created a network for the Episcopal churches. We were just really getting started when the fires hit. And we invoked our phone tree. And we did have one priest who was being evacuated because the fire was near her house, and somebody else who offered a place for her to come and stay. And that sort of action just right away, right, it gets people in. But then how to do the prevention with it. And then once they're in and committed to it, and especially you have a big disaster, guess what? I'm having a whole lot more success talking to people this year than I did before the fires, right? But once they're in the door, then you can bring in these other things in prevention, and you can re-engage that analytical side that actually this is more effective. But you sort of need the disaster for the emotional side. The occurrence of the disaster increases the emotional response, let's put it that way.
I'd like to believe also that communities of faith could build some of that compassion, drawing from our faith tradition and the call of God, without necessarily having to go through the disaster. Like, we could exercise the muscle of the invitation to love our neighbors and strangers.
Yeah, and we were working at it. It's just a whole slower process. The fire jump-started a lot for us.
Sure. Any last words of advice for good people of faith and hope in the community about what we can actually do?
Electrification, again, but also the best predictor of a community recovering from a disaster is the degree of social capital existing in that community. And social capital being a sociology term for the connections that people have to each other. A church is a place that has more social capital than most other of our societies. And so, and guess what? If you work together for disaster resilience, you start discovering you have a stronger community during peacetime. And so believing that local actions make a difference and doing it with other people and being willing to talk about it. Because I think that's one of the biggest issues that goes on is we just, we don't want to think about it and we don't have it in regular conversation, and it allows people who are well-meaning to forget. And every time you talk about it, you're helping a friend not succumb to the temptation to not notice.
That's a good word. And that pushes back against the trap I feel like I sometimes fall into when I'm thinking about my own disaster preparedness, which is thinking that it's an individual enterprise. Like, I've got my dehydrated food and my jugs of water in my basement and my backpack so that I can be okay, and I'm maybe going to have to fight off my neighbors.
All right, this is a, John's, somebody I worked with is here and is laughing at me because he's heard this more than once. It is an American problem that we are extremely individualistic. Right? The overwhelming majority of us are descended from people who chose to walk away from their own family, their own clan, to come and make a better life for themselves. So to put it in a nasty version, we are genetically selected for selfishness.
I think Californians even more so, because we're the weirdos that left I'm just speaking for myself, the weirdos that left our families to come out to
I don't know, I'm a fourth generation Californian at this point, but I guess somebody in the back all did this. Given that, we tend towards messaging that's very individualistic. Like, I've had arguments with FEMA about the preparedness messaging. And no, it has to be what an individual can do. If you make it a communal thing, then nobody's going to listen. It has to be individual. And so listen to the government messages. Have a kit, have a plan. You've got to protect your family. You. And there's an implicit message that your neighbor may become your enemy. And I actually did a thing with the LA Times at one point. They wanted me to do a thing on how to do a kit, and I refused. And we ended up with a headline, "Forget the kit, talk to your neighbor." And I think our real success is going to be that. And when I look, I don't really know so much what's gone over here after the fires, but I look at Altadena and the way it is recovering. The community is stronger there than it was before the fires, because people have really come together, and they are just a case study in how a strong community leads to recovery.
Thank you. This has been rich, and I have lots more notes and questions that we're not going to have time for tonight. But as we draw to a close, would you be willing to offer us a blessing? I thought about it. I'm an Episcopalian. We read our prayers. You've got a book that's got all the prayers in it. Right. You just opened to the right one.
I'm not going to read from the Book of Common Prayer. However, I want to offer a hymn, because for me, I'm not going to try and sing it because a cappella, it's not my friend at 71. And there's about 20 different tunes that's done for this. We limit not the truth of God to our poor reach of mind, to notions of our day and sect, crude, partial, and confined. No, let a new and better hope within our hearts be stirred. The Lord has yet more light and truth to come from his word. And God is a mystery, but God, the one thing I believe is God is calling us to love. So let's love each other, and work with each other, and help each other find the courage to care.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. And thank you all for being here. We have some refreshments outdoors. You're welcome to join us, and we hope to see you again soon at another event like this. Thank you for being a part of this gathering.